Good afternoon. It is Monday, October 15th. Welcome to your City Council informational meeting. First item is the administration communication. So I welcome Chief of Staff Erica Beck.
Good afternoon, Council. A couple of items. I know we have a busy agenda today, so I'll keep it brief. Update from Park and Rec. On November 13th at the informational meeting, there will be an update on the Emerald Ash Borer response, including information on a reforestation plan. So I know that that has come up before, so November 13th is when we'll hear more about that in greater detail. Also, Parks is working on an ordinance that would allow e-bikes on the bike trail system and side paths in Sioux Falls. The Park Board is expected to consider that ordinance on November 20th, and then that would be brought forward to Council at an informational meeting on December 4th, followed by a first and second reading following that or later that month. So e-bikes, the new ordinance that will be moving forward regarding that. In Planning and Development Services, I think during the last Land Use Committee meeting, representatives from that department talked a little bit about the 2018 Citizens Planning Academy. And the first session of that two-session academy was held on October 1st. There were 36 people in attendance, and those same 36 people are expected to attend the second session also, which is on October 29th. The graduates of that planning academy are then going to be invited to your council meeting on November 5th to be recognized. So heads up on that, but I thought that was a great turnout for that event. And then a couple of additional updates. We've talked a little bit about annexation and the planning staff bringing forward a presentation to you at next week's informational meeting to talk about the policy in regards to annexation. So just a heads up on that. And then November 5th at the next informational meeting, we've got three specific topics that are coming forward as updates. Per the request of Councilor Neitzert, Lloyd Company's representation will be making a project update to you on the Cascade project, which is on North Phillips Avenue. Don Kearney and his team in the Parks office will be talking about the Levitt Shell and progress that has been made on that project. And I also believe that you'll have an introduction to Nancy Halverson at that point as well. And then Sam Trebelcock, also from the Planning and Development Services team, will be talking about the tier maps that are related to Shape Sioux Falls that talk about how our community is growing into the future. Those were the only updates that I had. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll move on with the agenda.
Any questions?
Yes.
Councilor Starr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm curious, if we're going to do an annexation presentation, should we include our friends from the County Commission to be part of that as well? I mean, they're normally going to be here at 4 o'clock. It would probably be nice to extend an invitation to them as well, because I think that's where the discussion started, and I think both groups of us hearing that at the same time would be a good use of everyone's time.
We absolutely can do that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your time. Next item is City Council open discussion. Any City Council open discussion? Councilor Kiley.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Washington High School boys soccer team for their first ever state soccer championship this past weekend in Rapid City. And my intention is to also congratulate their coach, Dave Dantzler, who worked with young men from 11 different countries to make this happen. And so congratulations for them for their commitment to the sport and to their effort and to teamwork. One of the things that I thoroughly enjoyed about teaching and being on staff at Washington High School, because of the diversity at Washington High School, it was a true community atmosphere. And I think what the young men on the Washington High School soccer team did this weekend just illustrates how when we work together and collaborate, we can do anything. And I think it's a good role for the rest of the country to follow as well. So congratulations, Washington Warriors. It's a great day to be a Warrior.
Thank you. Any other open discussion? Councilor Brecky.
Yeah, I wanted to do this last week, but I I discovered, I was 10 minutes late last week, I discovered that the decorative clock on the shelf in the mayor's conference room is 10 minutes late. and so I wandered in 10 minutes late, all sorts of surprised. But what I wanted to discuss is just to share with the council and the members of the public. I went to the South Dakota Municipal League meeting a week ago and had some very valuable sessions, and I just wanted to share, what I learned there. There was a session on cybersecurity, which I went to, which was really, really, informative for me. Being a novice in that arena and just having a broad understanding of the kinds of threats that exist nowadays and how complicated it is to protect against those. I mean, in the government realm, it was just helpful. It was from a provider who actually provides those security systems, but it was just helping to understand that. And so that was just some extra knowledge I certainly appreciated having. But the other thing that was really valuable, and Christine, you were there and probably would agree, the gentleman that did the general sessions was a man, a professor from Minnesota or Michigan State University, and he spoke in 2 sessions, and I went to both of them, and that they brought him in. He was really good, and he really talked about regionalism. And again, that was a concept that is new to me in this capacity as a political official. Just that is kind of the wave of the future, especially in an area such as ours. The idea that we should be thinking as the city of Sioux Falls in a much more regional way, and even the definition of region. He talked at length about that. How do you even define region, and what is it? And then I heard his sessions, and then he did a general session as well, and he had actually had a grant where they studied 382 small cities. And they studied cities that were vibrant, had become vibrant, and tried to find out kind of what the recipe was for a small city to make it smart, to not die out, but grow. And that was, I think, extremely helpful, obviously, to the other small cities in there. But it was also helpful to me with that regional thinking, and how we might apply ourselves in a more brotherly fashion to our smaller communities, and not just, think of them in terms of the revenue that they generate for a city, but in a way that we can work together in a more regional fashion. And then on the heels of that, I heard the mayor at Senator Thune's meeting, and he talked about a possible relationship with Madison, South Dakota, and what they're doing in becoming a worldwide leader in cybersecurity, and how that one of their negative things for them is their growth because they're in Madison, South Dakota, and how could we do things with them to actually, help them and help us. And so I was just really benefited from that experience. I want to share that with all of you, to just and challenge you as well to think in a regional way. And I could see that the mayor is, so I do think it's just it was very important, very valuable, and I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Councilor. Any other open discussion? I'll add on to what Councilor Brecky said. This last week I had the opportunity to do a national presentation for NCLS and NACO, which is basically for counties. Myself and Cindy Heiberger, along with Aaron Sertska from the county, gave a presentation on safety and justice challenge, criminal justice reform, jail reduction, and how the city and the county really collaborates with that. We talked about our long withstanding history of many of the services that we share, whether it's through GIS, Health and Human Services, the police and sheriff's office, and then really focused a lot on juvenile justice and how we've made some big impact in Sioux Falls and really the region. And then on top of that, we talked about the triage center and how we've moved slowly to make sure we're doing it right and getting the information out. And you'll hear more information about that again soon. But it was an hour-long presentation, and it really focused on our collaboration. And for them to want to use Sioux Falls and Minnehaha County as an example, I think speaks very highly of our community. And so I want to share that with you. The other thing I wanted to share, just our kind of calendar as we're going through this. Next week, we do have a joint city-county meeting on October 23rd. October 30th is the 5th Tuesday, so we generally do not have any meetings that day, just so the public is aware of that. And then November 5th, our normal city council meeting will be on Monday again, due to the National League of Cities conference that several councilors are traveling out of the state for. So just making sure you're all aware of those 3 different changes, and anyone here in the public as well that attends our meetings regularly. So with that, we will move on to our first presentation, September monthly financials. Assistant Director Tom Huber, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's your last one. Make it good.
Yes, sir. Tom Huber with the Finance Office. Yeah, I'm being watched, so I had to be in tip-top shape. As we've just been discussing the past several months, so we continue to make some improvements to the monthly report. Always looking for feedback on those changes, whether and any additional things that you would like to see in the report. Again, focusing on presenting information that's valuable and informative in dashboard type formats. And we've also included the summary on TIFs this month, so that's been a work in progress, so it's finally here. And with Sean coming on board now, will give us even more opportunity to take a fresh look at our financials and make additional improvements, so looking forward to it. Taking a look at September, first our first economic indicator, unemployment. You can see that it continues to trend down across the board. We don't have state and local numbers yet for September, so the chart only goes through August. But quick look forward, the national unemployment rate has that was recently released for September was a rate of 3.7%, which is the lowest since 1969, I believe. And as you can see, both the state and city unemployment rates trend fairly well below the national unemployment rate. So, from the job market perspective and finding a job, there are jobs available, and we continue to see unemployment run very low. Building permits is the next one we take a look at. You can see the activity continues to remain strong with 2018 valuations measured on the blue bar on the chart, again topping the last 2 years through September. Again, great for growth. Does introduce some other pressures to the market, but a great indicator for growth. Looking at inflation, it had been trending upward until the last couple months, and you can see that it's pulled back. Some of the inflationary pressures, primarily due to some moderation in energy costs that had been spiking a little bit. As this impacts both revenues and expenditures, it does give us some forward-looking perspective. It's something that we keep a close eye on. Key indicator for the city, obviously, is our sales tax. And looking at the short-term trend with the year-over-year monthly growth, you can see that growth did moderate a little bit in September, which is exactly what we would have expected, given both September and October of last year being the time frame is when we started to experience a rather dramatic shift in growth in 17. So would kind of expect somewhat similar in October, and then you can see growth moderated through the first quarter of, or the last part of 2017 and the first quarter of 2018, and then really started to pick up mid-year. So we'll keep a close eye on sales tax trends, but again, still trending very favorably. If you look at the long-term growth, the change didn't much impact the long-term growth metric, as the 12-month rolling average, excluding office, ticked down to only 4.5%. Again, it takes a fairly substantial move at this time of the year. We'd have to actually see decreases in growth in order to bring that number down significantly. So, on track to what we've been forecasting, and we'll keep an eye on it and see what happens throughout the rest of the year. Looking at overall revenues for the city's general fund, year to date, we are 3% ahead of last year. If you tie the bar chart on the right to the numbers on the left, you can see that sales and property taxes are obviously the two biggest parts of that increase. However, licenses and permits also contributed to some of the increase, as permitting revenues have remained strong. And I think we've mentioned before that we sold 2 liquor licenses in July of this year, so that always helps the licensing and permitting numbers. Looking at expenditures for the general fund, you can see that we are 1% ahead of this same time last year. Although we are closely monitoring a few of the departmental budgets, most are tracking well to both budget and forecasts. But as we've been discussing, for most of the year, we'll be coming forward with a provisional budget supplement for the Highways and Streets Department. Be doing that in November for snow removal, given the toll winter and spring snow and ice had on this budget, and we obviously all saw what happened the other day with snow on the ground. So the last time we did a provisional budget was in 2015, which was again for snow. The provisional supplement simply allows us the authority to supplement the budget up to a certain amount for a specific purpose, and in this case, snow removal. So if it's not needed, it doesn't get supplemented in. If it's needed, the administration has the authority to spend that money. So we're in the process right now of updating our general fund forecast. So we'll get into more detail on our year-end forecast next month, just as we did in the June report, come out with a little bit more detail on what do we expect the final numbers to look like for the general fund. The new dashboard component that we've added this month provides a quick snapshot of the city's capital program. You can see what the city has invested or committed. In this case, over $137 million in the overall capital program. That would include both the sales tax and the enterprise funds and all the city's funds. That would represent about a 60% of the money has been either spent or committed to this point in the total program. If you look just at the sales tax on the right of the capital program, you can see that and again, sales tax being mainly just highways and streets, parks and recreation, those general departments, public safety. You can see that it's 82% spent or committed, with $57 million being spent or encumbered. It's just a metric that we kind of watch is how are we doing in getting these investments made and put on the streets. On the total capital program, some of them take a little bit longer. These are some of the enterprise funds investments, and Mark will be talking about some of those a little bit later. So they take a little bit longer and go from year to year more than on the sales tax side. Things really happen rapidly and can usually wrap up within a year or so. So just a little look at how those two pieces work of the overall program. Again, there's more specifics in your report as for all the projects and each of the departments. Again, this just shows a brief snapshot of the investments that are being made in specific departmental areas. The highest being obviously highways and streets and our street infrastructure. You have water rec and water and storm drainage, all having major investments in infrastructure, as well as the parks program. And on the right, you can see we just kind of highlighted, engineering provided us a quick snapshot of some of the street maintenance construction that has been done so far this year. Putting a lot of money to good work to strengthen the city's infrastructure. Lastly, I'll just highlight on page, forget what page it's on in your report, it's page 6. We've added a TIF dashboard that just kind of adds to, we have the TIF fund already in there and have had it in there in the past months, but this just outlines a more concise summary of all the active TIF districts. It provides both the beginning and ending year as approved by the TIF plan. It has the base and current equalized valuations, as well as the property taxes that are being levied from comparing. And I think one of the questions last time was, what are the base property taxes and what are the current property taxes now that the project's been completed. It's got the increment paid to date, and lastly, the total reimbursable approved project costs. This would include the financing and interest costs that would be associated with the project, as those can be a little bit unknown as payments come in. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you would have.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. Any questions on the report that Councilor Neitzer?
On the TIF dashboard, the total reimbursable, In some cases, the increment paid to date is larger. Is that because the extra would be financing
That would
costs?
be either financing or interest costs that would be associated with those projects.
And does I don't recall, does each TIF cap the amount that can be reimbursed of financing
Some have
costs?
caps on reimbursements, some don't. As far as what amount of interest can be reimbursed, the project costs are pretty well set inside of the project plan that you approve when you approve each TIF district. And as you can see, a good case in point is the first two up there are obviously both over the top of what was in the approved project costs, which is the financing costs that would be associated with the SHRAPA. The city's actually has bonds and is paying those bonds back. And then on the TIF 7 would be interest on that project.
Okay, thanks.
Councilor Starr.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Tom, tell me a little bit, I know November we're going to start collecting our online tax, and then, we'll see some numbers in our December that were paid from the state. We won't see a lot before the end of the year. Did we make any adjustments when we did the budget to anticipate any of those revenues between now and the end of the year?
We didn't. It was one of those tailwinds that we considered when we were assessing out what growth rate should we assume on sales tax. That was one of those tailwinds that we talked about, that we know it's going to have a positive impact. I don't expect we'll see a lot of it, because by the time we get some of those monies in, that'll be January, beginning of next year, when we start to really see what happens. But it was just one of those things that we considered when we set the overall rate.
Thank you.
And I believe and I know just enough to be dangerous on this, so I will get more information and send it to the full council from Yvonne, but during our board meeting, she was discussing the tax that will be going away on internet, not internet sales, but it's a fee on on your internet services.
Service providers?
Yes, and so that fee is essentially going away, and I believe it's like South Dakota is experiencing, we will lose over $5 million in municipalities across the whole state, which we'll have to, some of that will balance it out as well. And then I know that there were some triggers in the legislature as well that dealt with if you hit a certain amount, then the money goes to two different areas as well. And so making sure we understand all those details are important. So any other questions on the finance? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move to our next presentation. Water reclamation projects. Welcome, Director Mark Cotter.
Good afternoon, Chair and Councilors. Thank you for having us today. We've got a team with us today from multiple departments that have been working on the Water Reclamation Master Plan. The master plan itself took about 2.5 years. Today we hope to frame up in this presentation for you really what is water reclamation. It's one of the key basic utilities that modern cities have. We did do a 20-year look forward on a master plan for both the collection and the treatment process. We'll share with you what that told us so we can continue to have reliable wastewater, and then ultimately what those priority projects impact will be on our customers' rates. So let's get started. All right, water reclamation, what it is. You've got a collection system that moves wastewater to the water reclamation treatment facility. Got the water reclamation treatment facility that cleans the water. We have a biologic process, very robust process that's served the city well for, by the time we make the upgrades, almost 40 years. And then the clean water is discharged into the river. Let's talk a little bit more about the collection system. So the wastewater from your sinks, tubs, toilets moves from your house to the sanitary sewer collection system. When you look at the expanse of the city of Sioux Falls, almost 80 square mature miles, we've got almost 900 miles of collection mains. And so that's beyond the distance between here and Dallas, Texas, that our collections team maintains to make sure people have a good, reliable treatment system and collection system. And the collection system typically moves the wastewater based on our geography and topography to a pump station, and you see that in the graphic as we try to utilize gravity as much as possible, but just our general topography need a system of pump stations. And then the pump station lifts the wastewater and pushes it through a pressurized line, or what you'll refer to in this presentation as force mains, to the water reclamation treatment facility. The appropriate treatment steps are taken. We showed a tractor on there because there's a byproduct of wastewater treatment that ultimately, once we stabilize the solids, that's a great amendment for neighboring farmers that we apply to their fields so they can offset some of their fertilizer costs. All right, many people don't really know where the wastewater treatment facility is, which I think is a great compliment to the leaders that came before us that really looked decades into the future, identified land, generally away from residential development, and bought a substantial amount of land. The footprint of land that the city owns that's on the wastewater treatment campus is about 410 acres. The campus itself is about 65 acres. And what that really does is it provides adequate buffer, but it provides land so we can do what we're going to talk about today, which is expand for our emerging population growth. But just to give you a perspective, that 60th Street on the north, that's the east-west road just below 90, Interstate 90, and that's right on south of Sycamore Avenue. All right, when a customer gets their bill, they'll get a bill for water and wastewater, and I'll just, once in a while, I'll use a mouse to kind of point to certain areas. So this being the water portion, and full disclosure, Deborah Gaikowski is our project manager. This is her bill. And so she was willing to share it with us. And so the top portion is the water. Again, we have a basic charge and a volumetric charge for water. We're here today to talk about wastewater. And so we have a fixed charge based on the meter, and then we charge by the volume. One of the things that I think our city can be very proud of is we historically have one of the lowest basic charges in the entire region, and so people pay for what they use, and so it is a strong incentive for conservation. So in this case, based on today's current rates, to use 5 consumption units, which each consumption unit we'll talk about. One consumption unit is essentially 748 gallons. You make those extensions, her wastewater portion of her bill is $25.40. All right, the current state. We've got an aging infrastructure, a very harsh environment with wastewater, with the corrosive gases and the constancy of it. Many of these assets never stop. That's why you have to design them so that they can run 24/7, 365 for the life of that infrastructure. When the power goes out, there has to be a generator that kicks on so we can continue to provide reliable wastewater service. We've had steady population growth. When you look back and have those conversations with planning and development services, you'll see that our region generally grows by about 1.8 to 2.1% every year. It's very steady growth. I think we're very fortunate to have many, many years of very constant growth, and allows planning to really assist us in making those projections on how many people come to our community and region every year, and how can we best be positioned to address them. Certainly have a growing commercial and industrial base. We've had requests for regionalization. City of Brandon, Renner, T have all signed long-term agreements. The City of Harrisburg, today, their approach is they are going to build their own plant. But we always set ourselves up that from a region standpoint, we wanted to be Plan B. We wanted to be able to be one that they would compare, either expanding their own assets or coming to Sioux Falls. And that whole process that got kicked off around 2011, wrapped up around 2013, has really been, I think, a really good standpoint for our region. And then one of the things that we'll always do when we're doing a project at the wastewater plant, we are preparing ourselves for future regulatory requirements, and we'll be positioning the plant for that as well. All right, so we wrote a master plan, and this required us to bring in a national expert that really can help guide us through a master planning process. If you get a chance, there's 2 decks up here. That is the outcome of this 2.5-year master plan that thoughtfully looked at the collection system, growing the collection system to serve additional growth, and then also the existing plant and also expanding the existing plant. First step in that process is to review the city and regional growth area projections and land use planning. So Councilor Brecky, these population projections include the community, but they also include the region. We expect, based on that very steady growth, that we'll see a population increase over the next 20 years, almost an additional 120,000 people. That's the city of Sioux Falls and the region. We want to make sure that we're positioned for that growth. So now, once you take the growth projections, you start to project every person as a specific amount of wastewater that we need to account for. And so you take those population projections, you look at your historical flows, look at I&I, and then ultimately start to predict what your future wastewater flows are. Current plant is rated at 21 million gallons a day, and there's a green line that's shown on this graph. Based on our current projections, we only showed just based on trying to do the look forward for you. We've got several years of history. Our trend line is showing that we'll essentially be beyond our capacity by 2024. That's why you see a thoughtful capital plan that really executed between 19 and 23 so we can be positioned to continue to meet our permit requirements, but also meet the population projection. 3 and 4 are critical. We model the existing collection system, recommend optimization and improvement alternatives, and then 4, concurrently, we're developing a collection system master plan to serve additional areas. And so you'll see that for the number 3 effort, there's 11 existing lift stations that need improvements done to them, and we've included those in the list of projects. And then as we look at number 4, one of the things that you'll see is some of the easiest to serve land is beyond us. And so now when you look at the west side of Sioux Falls, we looked at a number of different scenarios on what's the best way to serve the west side of Sioux Falls. You know, essentially the land generally falls naturally by gravity from Wall Lake, from the west to the east all the way to like the T. Ellis Road area. And so you have to look at that and say, we want to make sure we have a really long-term approach. Should we take that wastewater through town by upsizing existing pipes? Do we build a treatment plant specifically for that growth area? Do we take that wastewater around the top of the city? And ultimately, all of those alternatives, which are in the master plan, boil up to what's the most efficient way to grow that particular area. And we essentially do that for the west, the east, and the south. Generally, the north is floodplain, and so you won't see a lot of growth area to the north. All right, number 5, then once we actually collect that wastewater, we've got to responsibly treat it. And so we've taken a look at every asset of the plant and looked at what it's needed. Just to give you a perspective, this is the plant up that we showed early and how wastewater flows through this plant. I know a number of you have taken the opportunity to come out to the plant and spend time with the team. But essentially, the wastewater comes right in the center of this structure. Up here is the office and maintenance teams where our labs are. This is the storage for the collection vehicles, cameras, vac trucks, what have you. Wastewater comes into this area, goes through a series of large screens to take out the rags and the gravels. So essentially, we call that preliminary treatment. And then it comes through this area. This is primary treatment. This is when we're settling out those solids and then taking them onto thickening them and taking them into a digester complex. Those solids have to be stabilized. The outcome of them ultimately goes to a farmer's field. Our process today is to store those solids in these large lagoons, and then we apply those biosolids in the spring and the fall outside the growing season. The amount of solids we're starting to generate is almost beyond what we can apply in that spring and the fall, and especially with the capacity of farmers now with those large planters, we have a very small window to apply those. So I've done a pilot project, and our best approach now is to take those solids out of the digesters, essentially dry them into a powdered fertilizer, And then we can work with teams like Parks, and they can use a very good Class A fertilizer and offset some of their fertilizer needs. What that does is it frees up these lagoons so we can use this for peak shaving. We get questions, are we expanding the plant for those large rain events? And we're not. We'll show you some projects throughout, but cities across the country, City of Sioux Falls is one of them. We're building strategic equalization basins. This one will hold about 16 million gallons of wastewater. So when high flows are coming toward the plant, we can peak shave those off, put them in a large area to hold them till the storm event goes through, then we'll meter those flows back through the plant. We just want to build the plant to meet the population growth, and we'll strategically build equalization basins to get us through those peak days, okay? So the wastewater comes down through here, the solids pass on, they get digested, and back. The other clear water that comes off the primaries goes through secondary treatment. Once it makes its way through that, goes through this pump station, and then ultimately through activated sludge, final clarifiers, a filter room, chlorine contact, and then out to the river. Essentially, if you're out there, if you follow this line, everything that is right of my mouse here doesn't exist today. And so this will be, the blue is what needs to be built by the end of 2025, and the orange really needs to be built in that 5 to 15 year time frame. That will be future regulatory requirements. Okay. All right. A lot of detail, so I won't spend too much time on this. But out of the master plan, then you really start to prioritize when projects get delivered that ultimately inform the rate model that our customers pay. And so, if you look at a particular project, like let's look at this particular pump station, for example. There's 11 pump stations in our system that have an identified improvement that came out of the master plan. So we begin the design and bidding, and then the blue tells us about how long that's going to take to get complete. So that work would ultimately begin design in 2019. We would expect the project to be done by about the third quarter of 2020. And you just look at these across of when those projects will get delivered. Pump Station 240, we'll spend some time on that today. We got a substantial amount of design and easement acquisition to do, so we've got 2 years worth of that type of work, and then we've almost got 2.5 years of construction. So the master plan really prioritizes when those projects get delivered, and then they inform the rate model and the if we need to go to the debt market for revenues, or if we use user fees. Okay. All right, so let's talk about some of those large projects that came out of the master plan that we can provide a little additional detail to. The Equalization Expansion project, just like we talked about at the plant, that can hold wastewater during those peak events. We also have one down by the Street Fleet campus. Okay, so let me orientate you here. So this is the Street Fleet campus down on Chambers. This is Cliff Avenue. Here's the River Bridge and the Big Sioux River. This right here is Smithfield Foods. The City of Sioux Falls has a equalization basin. It's a concrete tank that holds about 12 million gallons of wastewater. We've used that to its fullest extent. We've had emergency situations that over here in those lime lagoons we've discharged wastewater into to avoid discharging to the environment. Recently, a few years back, I think I've shared this with you, that the City of Brookings built an earth and equalization basin that holds about 28 million gallons of wastewater. We've designed one to fit on this site that would add an additional 20 million gallons of wastewater, and it's generally outlined there with that dash line. Collectively, right here at a really critical spot, we'll be able to hold about 32 million gallons of wastewater during those peak events. Main pump station replacement. This is probably outside of the plant the most critical piece of infrastructure to serve and provide reliable wastewater service. This one we drove by the other day if you were on the tour, and I'll just try to get this. There we go. This is the existing pump station, and it was put online in 1982. It is, it's never shut off. By the time that it's replaced, we'll have operated for 40 years, a very caustic environment. It needs to be upgraded. We've taken it to its extent of its life. The replacement will be able to pump about 65 million gallons of wastewater a day. It moves approximately 90% of the city's wastewater, and it has an estimated design and construction cost of $24.4 million. We did an analysis on siting. Initially, we were planning to build it right here on existing city land. Once we started to get into design and discussions with contractors, asking them what special shoring systems, dewatering systems, what activities will you have to do to keep that existing pump station running while constructing another one. Those costs exceeded $500,000 just with that type of risk in construction. So then we started to look at, is there available land that we could do a greenfield site? This land was available. We did an analysis. This was purchased by the city of Sioux Falls, the water reclamation team. Now we'll have a really good long-term piece of land. We can do a greenfield site. If you guys remember, many councilors stood out here. This is where those 72-inch pipes were at that we took some pictures inside of before it went in. That's what this stretch is. Okay. All right, we just wanted to give you a graphic of how important is that wastewater pump station. And so the light blue is the area that ultimately that wastewater flows through, and it's a critical piece of infrastructure for the city of Sioux Falls. We're through preliminary design and we're moving into final design. The other major pump station is coming up and essentially serves the east side of Sioux Falls, and the phase one is this white. Another phase will be down here. We'll show you a slide here shortly. All right, we just wanted to give you a couple of cutaways now with advanced design techniques. We can really start to see what that new pump station design looks like, how it's going to function, but also better inform bidders so they have a better handle on the expectation, and then they can start to bid the projects accordingly. Just to give you a perspective of how this pump station will work, essentially the brick is above ground, the gray is below ground, so there's certain parts of this building that will be almost 50 feet below ground. The wastewater comes in from this side and passes by these gray screens. These are big elevator screens that then take up any rags, large rocks, 2x4s. We've had bikes. Anything that can get in the collection system one way or another. We want to protect the downstream pumps, and then they'll be conveyed up, put into a dumpster, and then they're hauled off to the landfill. Then the wastewater passes through, goes around the back side, gets picked up by these pumps, ultimately put in this pressurized line and off to the plant. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the new design techniques that we have so we can start to visualize what these projects look like. All right, second pump station that really opened up the east side of the city of Sioux Falls has served us now for about 15 years. The original structure was actually sized for almost 20 million gallons a day. It had an initial design capacity of about 3.5 million gallons a day. And so in this particular one, now to go into phase two, we'll be putting in either a 30 or 36-inch diameter line to the plant and making some modifications inside, and then we'll be able to really serve that east side and that southern area more. This is another scenario where you look at a number of options. About 15 years ago, our initial thoughts were we'd likely be building a second treatment plant on the east side of town. Adjacent to this structure. As that has evolved over time and a thoughtful analysis has been looked at, it is more efficient, more cost effective to take that wastewater back to the plant. And so that's the recommendation out of the master plan. But again, a number of different scenarios are looked at so you can make a good informed decision. Here's another graphic. The area that this pump station currently serves is the new growth area on the east side of town, and it will serve the future area when this is opened up. This will be, this is probably 8 to 10 years before this area is opened up. We still have a substantial amount of land to mature before we open up more land of that magnitude, okay? I want to take one more step back here. We talked about equalization. We'll be laying out a strategic location out here for an equalization basin. Again, as those peak flows come through, we want to be able to shave those off, put them in a basin, allow the storm to pass, and then we meter those flows back in. It just allows us to do it much more efficient, much more cost effective. We talked about that there's 11 lift stations in the system that need to have a variety of issues, whether it's the HVAC systems, the roof systems, electrical components, things like that, upgraded flow meters, and so they've all been identified and included in the master plan. All right, now for the water reclamation facility and the improvements, it's really to address the aging infrastructure. We've got a great plant. But we need to make a timely investment now to extend the current asset's life, and then we need to expand it to meet the population growth and position the facility for future regulations. We do expect, just with the complexity of keeping a plant operational while you expand it, we think the best methodology to deliver the project is to use a design and a construction manager at risk. We can get as the design progresses, we can get firm costs in parallel, and the investment that we have identified that's in the capital plan is $159 million for the next 5 years. Okay, just to kind of frame up what that structure looks like, City of Sioux Falls as the client, design engineer, and construction manager at risk has been very successful on projects, and really once the negotiation through the cost of work and the general conditions gets done, all the subsequent packages, whether they're the footings and foundations to the roof, it's all open book process, a very good, efficient way. We've had good success in it. The state engineers, they build projects on campuses. It's become their preferred delivery method on the state campuses as well. You guys know, I just wanted to add this more for the public that's watching. The selection process goes through an RFP. It does allow the design and construction pricing to happen concurrently, and the selected contractor commits to delivering the project within a guaranteed maximum price. And just to add to that, you're working in parallel with the designer and a constructor, but at some point in time, the owner can say, all right, provide me the guaranteed maximum price. That's when they take the specifications, the plans where they're currently drawn, and a narrative of what the client's expectations are, and then they price that up. And that's the guaranteed maximum price. If there's an owner change from there, that would be an add to that process. But that's how we've gone through that, and it's worked very good. Some benefits: a very collaborative delivery method that provides the city more control. The contractor provides their experience and expertise in the design process, and the contractor provides early construction cost input leading to cost certainty. That is critical when you're in the middle of rehabilitating an existing plant and expanding it. We wanted to put in a slide that provides some overview of how we expect these projects to be funded, essentially what informed the rate model. So the Equalization Basin, that's down by the Street Division campus, we did just bid that project. There's two components to that. The Equalization project actually came in right on bid. There's a dumping station for our street sweepers, our vac trucks that maintain the collection system, and then all the septage haulers. That came in at about double. And so you may have seen that bid last Thursday. We are taking a step back to look thoughtfully at that bid, and we're likely going through a redesign with that dumping station to make sure we can get a cost-effective design. We're happy with what the Equalization Basin came in, but just how we bid it, I'll have to give you more insight once we get through our due diligence on that bid. Okay. Main pump station replacement, certainly do expect to work closely with the state of South Dakota to source their low interest loans through the state revolving fund, and then those would be repaid with user fees. Pump station 240, that would also be a loan project. Collection system improvements, those lift station rehabilitations, for the most part, those would be paid with cash or user fees. And then the large project, the water reclamation facility improvements and expansion project, we would, over the course of the 5 years, leverage low interest state revolving loan funds. All right, AE2S does an annual utility rate survey that really benchmarks communities in multiple states. I know you've seen these before. The point here that I want you to say is there's a volume that's been picked of 6,000 gallons. You'll see that that is more than what our typical wastewater customer uses on a monthly basis, but they have to pick a number so then they can benchmark us against the other communities. One of the things that City of Sioux Falls has been very proud of, and we should continue to, is we have a very low basic charge, and then our volumetric rate, people pay for what they use. So having a low basic charge really incentivizes conservation. All right, we've taken a thoughtful look at the projects that are in the master plan. Back in the end of March, we shared with you the key elements of this master plan. We also said at that time the conceptual rates at that point in time for 2020 through 2022 would likely be 6, and 6%, then transition into inflationary rates. We're happy to show you today that we've been able to refine the capital plan, how we'll deliver the projects, and ultimately the cost, and would be bringing forward later in November a 4-year rate package that would show customers' rates for 2020, since rates are set through 2019 today, of 6%, 5%, 4%, and 3% as we transition into inflationary rates. That's the blue line. I know you've looked at that graphic in the past, and so we'll just, if you have any questions later, we can certainly come back to it. I wanted to give you some perspective on what's a typical customer in the City of Sioux Falls use for consumption, because we have an impact slide that informs this afterwards. So when you look at all of 2017, we sent out just under 600,000 residential bills. We look at the total CCF, or consumption units, 100 cubic feet, that was billed to residential customers, which is about 3.6 million CCFs. When you do the math, the average residential customer's consumption is 6.2 CCF, or about 4,638 gallons. Okay? So remember that number as we go through some of the next slides. All right, so what would these rate adjustments mean to that typical customer? So for 2020, 6% rate adjustment on a customer that uses 4,638 gallons, or 6.2 consumption units, based on the previous year's cost would have been $32.25. The 6% rate increase on that, on the basic and the volumetric charge, would increase their bill by $1.89 to have an extended bill for the average customer in 2020 of $34.14. So now, as these get pulled forward, this number gets pulled here. So in 2021, a 5% rate increase on that same volume used starts with $34.14 for the previous year monthly charge. The 5% rate increase adds an additional $1.74 to every month's bill to have an extended bill of $35.88. And then as you just essentially go down 6, 5, 4, 3, the typical customer's impact on a monthly basis in 2020 would be $1.89, then $1.74 for 2021, $1.45 for 2022, and $1.09 for 2023. Okay? That's per month. And then just a couple of last slides. We thought you'd be interested in what's the breakdown of what our customers use. And so we added this up. We did an output of how many customers on a monthly basis typically use one consumption unit, which would be 748 gallons. There's 2,379 customers that use that much, or about 5% of our customers. Okay, so this column is the percent of the total, and then this is the accumulated amount, okay? So let you look through those. How many of our customers use 4 consumption units? That has an equivalency of about 2,992 gallons per month. We've got just under 7,700 customers that use that amount, or about 17% of our customer base. This is what's interesting, I think, because you remember we based the rate impact slide off 6.2, right in this range. 52% of our customers use 4 consumption units or less. So when you look at that impact slide, they're going to also have less of an impact because remember, we have a very low fixed fee and we charge people based on the volume. Okay? And so as you go down through there, we've been asked that in the past and wanted to frame it up in a slide for you if you're interested. All right, action items. So recently in September, you approved the 5-year capital plan that has the water reclamation projects in it. They're 2019 through 2022. If you look at page 7, identifies the water reclamation investment of about $262 million for the next 5 years. The 2020 through 2023, that's a 4-year proposed utility rate increases. We would expect to be back in front of you to talk more thoughtfully about those rate increases in November and December of 2018. And then in the spring and the summer of 2019, we expect to start bringing design and construction manager at risk contracts forward for these projects. All right, a lot of slides, and we've got a number of team members here. If you have any questions, we'd love to answer them.
Thank you, Director. Any questions for Mark Cotter or his team? Councilor Staley?
I would like to use the overhead if I could.
Sure.
Do you want Dave Bixler to help? Yes. So he can pull through it while you address it. Maybe Dave, if you can come forward, please.
So, first of all, just for the public's information, the total cost for that consultant was, correct me if I'm wrong, Director Cotter, but $840,000, or was it $880?
It's 807 for the first consultant.
But I thought when you came up, when we talked, I think it was $840,000 when I asked you about that several months ago.
Just slightly less than that. You want me to clarify it?
Yes.
So our lead consultant that did the master plan was $807,000, and we did bring in a second national firm that only focuses on water and wastewater. They're Carollo, and they did a peer review of the study for about just under $18,000. Okay.
So that was for the 2-year study. My concerns is, as I'm looking through our little thing here, is that everything that we're going to be doing for the bond payment is going to be supported by user fees, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. So we're talking
Hold
about.
on one second. If we're going to ask questions from Director Cotter, I'd like to make sure that his questions are being heard in the microphone, so it's recorded. So I don't know, Counselor, if you'd like to maybe sit and have him do it that way. I just want to make sure everyone is hearing what's being recorded.
I get that. Okay. So but I just wanted to show, this was a little document, and you all have this, that I had Director Cotter do a few months ago in July. And so again, we're talking about a $260 million, $62 million investment paid for by the user fees. And I'm going to compare that to what we did with the event center. We've spent $119 million, so to speak, and we're making an $8 to $9 million bond payment on that each year. So I'm looking at this as a minimum coming from our user fees of $8 to $9 million to pay this back. And I will say that the chart he showed us looked very innocent. I understand that. But I did want to talk about some facts that I asked him for. I said, and it's on our sheet up here, I said, how many customers did we have in 2016, and there were 53,020 active customers. And it's on your sheet you have, and it's also up here. So we had 53,020 customers, 46,482 were single family, 2,600 approximately multifamily, and 3,900 commercial. So then I said, how many do we have in 2018? So we have grown in 2 years. We have 1,644 new customers, residential. Okay, so we have not grown by 5,000 a year as far as people. We're talking about that number many times. 1,644 new single-family accounts, 137 new commercial accounts, and 1,865 multifamily units. And I believe we were talking about how that is calculated, and you said that they're not. Director Cotter, just explain what that 1865 was, please. When you talked about how we've grown in multifamily.
Point of order again, Madam Chair. I would request Councilor Staley to take a seat at the dais so that Director Cotter could be up at the podium and respond directly to your questions.
Well, he can certainly respond from here, but
And
I
as well as
I have
you
a
can
right
respond to.
Well, we have people do things from the dais all the time, and from the podium all the time. But let me just finish my concerns. I also said how many flows.
Excuse me, I think I made a point of order. I'd like to hear from our chair. Thank you.
Councilor Staley, I just want to make sure that everyone is getting the most use from the research that you've done and that we have. Director Cotter, so if you want to ask one question, and then I would like him to stand at the dais and answer each question before we ask multiple questions, making sure that everyone has the same level of respect from the podium as well. So I would prefer if we do it that way for now. If you choose to not sit, certainly your seat that you earn to sit at the dais or stand. But I want to make sure that this is done.
As we're going.
I understand that. I want to make sure that this is done so the citizens get the best benefit out of the research that you've done, as well as giving Director Cotter the same respect. So if you could ask one question, Director Cotter, and then I will have you answer each question and we can go back and forth.
And let me just clarify. I'm trying to drill down because we're being told we grow by 5,000 citizens a year, and Director Cotter has said on numerous occasions that we're going to double our population in the next 20 years. So I've been feeling that before we move forward with this, or up to 120,000 more, excuse me, maybe not doubled. I thought it was doubled at one time, but 120 you said today.
Okay, so there's one question. Director Cotter, I'd like you to address that question right there, please. Thank you. As far as...
So one of the initial graphics showed the bar charts on population, and with about a 1.8 to 2.1% growth rate a year, that compounding effect over a 20-year period of time grows our city and region by an additional 120,000 people.
Thank you.
And then would you clarify the multifamily figure of 1644? Because you said is that units? Because you said you didn't bill them for individual customers.
Where's the 1644?
I just subtracted the 2016 from the 2018 on multifamily
on number 3?
Yes. Well, number 2 is what happened in 2018, and number 3 is what's happening in 2016.
So can you please state your question so it's clear exactly?
That when we look at 1644 is the difference, is that individual apartment units or was that apartment buildings?
You know, Council Chair, I have not looked at this since July 16th, and those are math that Councilor Staley has done. Essentially what this frames up is, because this is an email from me.
It's on the overhead.
Okay.
Is why.
So
if we need to zoom it in, we can.
If you look at the first set of numbers, that's where we were at in 2018. And let's look specifically at multifamily. That number is 2,693 multifamily accounts. So if it's say it's an 8-plex or a 64-plex. Generally, multifamily has one sewer line and one water line, okay? And so that's why when you look at where multifamily numbers for 2018 were the 2,693, and the 2 years prior, they're at 2,609. I don't know where the math of this is without going back to that conversation in my notes, but it just shows that we have grown substantially with multifamily, but typically they are a single water line, a single sewer line. They also pay for their basic service, and they pay for their volumetric use. Typically, if our if our single family is growing by that amount, that also correlates that planning has very specific formulas on how many people are in a typical residential house and how many people are in a typical apartment. And that'd be a discussion that I think we'd like to be able to afford to bring planning and development services forward that really supports the population projections. And I think one of the things that I really want us to be proud of is that the city of Sioux Falls has had very steady growth at that 1.8 to 2.1, and in some years it will absolutely be at that 5,000 person amount based on the size of our community and region and that percentage. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So once again, and I've asked in the past, and I'm going to continue to state that I think part of the burden of this should be coming from our second penny. And I understand, and I brought this up when I ran in 2016, I've been talking about it for the last 10, 11 years, that we can certainly do that. We'd have to go through some steps to utilize having that support this. But again, I'm not understanding, and help me to understand, how $262 million is going to be paid off by these users. And when we talk about, we had, and the total users, let me just refer, the total active customer accounts, which I have on the overhead up here, and I'm happy to show this to anyone who wants to see it, but these are Director Cotter's numbers, is that in 2016, we had 53,000 customers, okay, 53,000. And in 2018, we had 54,885. So we're not, our customer base didn't grow a whole lot in 2 years. So we're projecting all of this stuff happening. And so I just have I'm not quite seeing how we're going to pay for that from these user fees, the 262. So maybe that'll become more clear as we move forward. Okay.
And Director Cotter, would you like to address that? The other thing that I'd reiterate that Director Cotter had already stated, with the multifamily, I own a 7-plex, so I only have one sewer line for my 7-plex. Now, I know people that have a 64-plex. They also have one sewer line. So while the numbers are not necessarily reflecting that many accounts on there, it's still users. There's still people using that. And so the numbers in the population is still essentially growing. It's just we might have a 64-plex versus a 7-plex and vice versa. And so I just want to make sure that's very clear that the numbers aren't going to be eye to eye as the growth. That doesn't mean that we're not growing. We just might have one person with 64 units under one account.
That's exactly right.
The other question I know that was brought up was the $62 million. I don't know if you would like to address that or if you'd like the finance department to
$262 million.
Sorry, I
262.
might have said it wrong. Sorry.
So the capital plan shows that there's an investment that's needed of $262 million. Part of that is you look at these detailed rate models, and we've got a thoughtful rate model that goes out to 20 years. We expect that and included in that detailed rate model, you have drivers on your operational costs. So you look at what wages, chemicals, electricity is going to do over that expected 20 years. You look at what your equipment is going to do over that expected 20 years. Then we start to plug in projects, and the ones that we feel like we should cash fund based on their size and type, we fund those in the model with cash, and then we start to deliver these large projects so we can spread them over a much longer time with a growing customer base over 20 years. And so historically, we've always done 10-year notes we're transitioning these larger projects over a 20-year period of time. Their asset value is going to last longer than 20 years, but that will also has a very smoothing effect on our customers' rates. And so the current customer count today won't pay for $262 million. It's a very detailed rate model that reflects the steady, consistent growth of our customers and ultimately when those obligations will need to be made over the next 20 years. And that's why you've seen the impact to our customers' rates today, that it's a very smoothing and modest approach to be able to deliver this amount of capital investment and still have some of the most affordable rates in our region.
And if
Councilor Staley, I'll come back to you. If there's any other questions to Mark Cotter's team, I'll go back to Teresa Staley if there's Councilor Staley if nobody else does. Councilor Sale.
Thank you for your presentation. I found it very interesting and certainly very easy to follow. I, for one, would appreciate that in 25 years when I flush the toilet is taken care of and don't want to be behind the scene when we come to that. I just have one clarification, if you could. And I'm looking at the projection growth for population, which seems to be in contention. I understand that you've got those numbers from the Southeast Council of Government and the Planning Department. So those are not your numbers, those are the ones that have been provided to you to project.
That's exactly right. And they are the experts in that area. Sorry.
Well, I do appreciate that, and I look forward to moving forward on your project. I think it's going to be exciting, and I would like to volunteer to take many tours as it goes on.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Councilor.
Go ahead, Councilor Neitzer.
So what were you planning to do maybe before the master plan and major capital expenditures that you maybe learned that maybe wasn't a good idea? Or you could have done differently? Like, did you have a project you were thinking about and then the master plan said go a different direction?
Oh, yes. And I also want to frame this up that traditionally this utility had a capital plan of about $100 million a year. I mean, this council has been very supportive, recognizing the investment that wastewater collection and treatment is massively expensive. It has to be able to survive in a very caustic environment, and that's why the improvements have to be what they are. One of the things with the master plan, two come to mind, and I think for a decent period of time until you really do a deep dive into, for example, the west side of Sioux Falls, we've got an area out there that people want to live in. They want to see that continue to grow. And generally the topography from Wall Lake naturally falls toward the city of Sioux Falls. So we know if we put the mains in large enough, deep enough, that we can generally sewer that area over generations to come. Once it gets into that area near, say, Cherry Lake, because that's where the river comes through, then we have to figure out what's the most effective way to look at that. And I'd have to look back, but I think it was 7+ alternatives we looked at is what do we do with that wastewater? From a standpoint of, we'd ultimately like to take it through town. And because closest distance is straight line, which would be through town. There's too many constraints to take that much wastewater through town. But we looked at several of them. Do we add parallel lines? Do we upsize existing lines? Then we said, since we've got a fairly strong Skunk Creek there, do we put a really high functioning treatment plant there and just treat the wastewater there and discharge it? Costs of treatment are very expensive, especially satellite facilities. So then we started to thoughtfully look at what if we took a pump station, supported it with an equalization basin right there to take care of the peak flows, and then ultimately sling it all the way around the top of the city. And the master plan shows that that's the most cost-effective way. That's just one of those examples that you're looking at. That's why the document is so extensive. That's why you're looking at so many alternatives to ultimately make a really good informed decision for the customers that come after us.
So this would be the future Basin 15 that we're talking about?
Right.
Okay, so it does flow actually from west to east until what? It hits a ridge line around where? Because we're out of land, we're running out of land right now just to the west of TLS Road.
Yeah, so we can expand Basin 15 to probably hold another 1,200 acres, and we mature about 350 acres a year collectively throughout the entire city. And so we know today, in the master plan showed it in one of those swim lanes. I'll get to that for you. That Basin 15 sanitary sewer extension, we expect to be in design in 2021 and start to deliver that project, so that's online by about 2023. That can open up about another 1,200 plus acres and really kind of put the foundation for much more, because that's one of those challenges that we'll have is initially we can push about 1,200 acres through the existing system, but we don't want to just limit ourselves for the future. So like those initial links on that project will be very deep and sizable pipes, because we talked about that area generally from Wall Lake to the city of Sioux Falls naturally drains. So, you see a fairly large dollar amount there, but it will be for a much more long-term strategy.
Okay, thank you. One or maybe one more, and then I'll just defer for now. Do you have any idea how much I&I is private versus public? By that I mean, if you were to scope all the lines, how much of the I&I is coming from inside of people's property lines on an old lines that they have to pay for versus lines that we can control? I have to imagine there's a significant amount of I&I coming from maybe old clay lines in people's front yards, things like that.
Well, I don't have one, and if Trent or Mark Perry do, I would welcome them to come up here. Just in general, when you look at the collection system, the city of Sioux Falls owns the system that's in the street. So the manholes in the main, that's about 900 miles. You can double that to add all the private sewers. And so, generally, the city of Sioux Falls is very, we camera the system every 3 years. And so we're identifying all those I&I locations as we can and programming investments. A private homeowner is not doing that. And so they may have a line with a breach in it for a number of years until there's a real problem. I don't know if we could really speculate what the amount is from private and public, but Trent, Mark? Okay.
Yeah, I was just curious because, if you were trying to really pin down a lot and clean it up, you're talking about tens of thousands of properties potentially. By the way, we're using these terms. Maybe you should explain what I&I is just so the public knows.
I&I, thank you for being informed on wastewater. So I&I is inflow and infiltration. It's essentially, it's water we don't want in the system. It could be from a bad joint. It could be from a manhole that's got bad joints and it's leaking in. It could be from a number of different things. Anyway, it could be from a manhole that gets hit by a tractor that's out mowing a drainage away, because a lot of times you put the mains near the lowest points. If we happen to hit one with a mower and they don't see it, knocks off the manhole, creek comes up during a high flow event, we get a lot of what we call I&I, inflow and infiltration. And so we're constantly combating that, and we've got about 50 smart meters in the system that really allows the plant team to identify where they're at, and then they can hone down on those particular areas, and we can catch that issue sooner than what we could in the past. Okay, thank you.
Councilor Brecky.
Just one question. You had said at the very beginning of your slideshow that it was well planned into the future, that the land mass out there, and that's going to take care of this next future, this next 20 years. Does that land mass provide for the future beyond that?
It does. Ryan Johnson, who's our principal sanitary sewer engineer, after going through the master plan and thoughtfully looking at, would we build a plant on the west side? Would we build a plant on the east side? We're not looking at that at this point. We're going to concentrate the efforts at the existing plant, and his last projection would be is that that plant will easily serve the city in its current location as the only plant for probably the next 50 years.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilor Kiley.
There were questions regarding the consulting fees, which were over $800,000, a lot of money. But this is a very large project that we need, as you stated early on, when you talked about the current state. We have an aging infrastructure. We have a steady population growth, which within 20 years is going to exceed 300,000 people. I mean, it's hard for us to fathom that, but those are the projections, which, by the way, those are going to be new individuals paying user fees that we're currently. So it's not going to be just us, the population today, that's funding all of this. It's going to be all the users now and as well as into the future. But we also hope to continue to grow our commercial businesses and industry as well, too. As you've talked about, there's other requests for regionalization from other communities around us to participate. And there's advantages to doing that, too. There's power by the volume or numbers. And then future regulatory requirements are just going to continue to most likely become more stringent. Well, going back to the consulting fees, can you tell me how we benefit by paying out in excess of $800,000 in consulting fees before we get started with a project of this nature? What is the potential payback in that initial investment?
Well, the payback is substantial. It's like any profession. You want to make sure you have the most qualified people at the table, so you're making, very informed decisions. And if we would have, maybe not focused on a firm that does this type of work for cities across the country and the world, you don't have that expertise to really be in the room saying, all right, let's look at 7 or 8 different strategies on how we're going to serve the west side. We may not be able to have a thoughtful conversation about how do we optimize the existing plant and then expand it. It really comes down to qualification-based work, and if you look at the amount of capital that's been identified in the master plan, $262 million, and the amount of that fee, it's a fraction of a percent. So we would always recommend that we stick with qualification-based selection, and it will pay the city dividends going forward.
Okay, thank you, Director.
Councilor Staley.
And let me say, I was very excited and encouraged when our mayor gave his introductory budget presentation this summer and said he's not a big fan of consultants. He stated that. And I think sometimes consultants can be used to be a vehicle by which to support the project that is desired to happen. So not quite as enamored with that. However, on my sheet, I'm not up there to show this, but also Director Cotter, I asked what percentage of information, I said, what percentage of our intake comes from other communities? And you said 6% right now.
That's right.
6%. So I'm hoping that would, of course, as we're talking about regionalization, that number would go up. Also, when we're talking about population, and I've been asking the question, I've been saying this for 2.5 years, when we talk about growing by 5% a year, or 5,000 a year, I say, who are these people? Are they babies? Are they senior citizens? Are they executives? Where do they live? I'm not getting that information. So, I've been asking different governmental entities, we're meeting, and they're saying, oh, we were growing 5,000 a year. I say, where did that number come from? And they don't really know. I'm saying let's wait till the 2020 census when we have an independent entity coming in, assessing who we actually have living here, and then I'm going to feel more comfortable about what our number is. But if we don't grow, then please, colleagues, forgive me for scrutinizing things, but this body and the mayor are the only accountability factors that our city departments have. The residents, I believe the citizens look to us to vet things out. And if this was any other smaller community in South Dakota, we would be inviting a conversation about the nuts and bolts of a big project like this. I mean, you talk to the mayor of Baltic, I mean, they're excruciating over, do we buy a new vehicle? I mean, everything gets vetted. In Sioux Falls, it's running by us at 120 miles an hour, and we're trying to grab certain elements and saying, what in the heck is going on here? So it doesn't mean I think we need to expand, but I think we need to use a little common sense too, and I have a right to vet this out. The other thing I asked about, because we were using figures this summer of how many gallons we were using. Well, guess what? People were dumping their sump pumps into the waste treatment system. And they used to do more of an active approach to say, don't do this. And I believe in Gary Hansen's time, they were going around and fining people if they suspected they weren't letting that stuff go out into the grass. But I asked you how many consumptions we used this summer. It was 15.29, or excuse me, in January and February, 15.29. 15 in the winter months when there's no extra runoff coming in. So what I'm saying right now, the sky is not falling. I understand we need to plan for the growth, but we need to be, I'm a conservative person. If I don't want to get us on a limit, 260 million, and then we don't grow quite as fast as we thought, and then the bill is going to come right on the tops of the heads of our residents. And they expect us to watch out for them that way as well. So I'm glad you've adjusted the rates, because that's good. I like that. But again, I think there's still options that can be looked at, and you're bringing your dream plan to us, and I think in most circumstances, Mr. Cotter, you probably get your dream plan, because there's really not a lot of pushback. There hasn't been traditionally since I've been watching this. So I'm just stating that. Don't take it personally. I know you're working hard, but it's a lot of money, and it's going to affect our residents.
Any other questions from council? Councilor Neitzer.
So who can build this? Is there very specialized construction firms that can do a wastewater treatment plant? Who would be bidding on this?
There's a number of them, and I think that you'd pair them up. For many of you have been out to the treatment plant, so one of the key things is it's a lot of just tankage. It's a lot of concrete. We've got a lot of high-functioning general contractors in the area. There's also contractors that all they do is wastewater plants. We have an active project right now at the plant to modernize the digestion process. It was about an $8 million project. Local contractor from the Del Rapids area. Gritter Construction is building the lift station for Foundation Park, and they're out of Minnesota. We've had PKG. There's a number of firms that can do this kind of work.
Okay, and then could you show your the screen that shows the operating reserve, the capital reserve, and it kind of shows the slope to show that you're staying above your reserve target with your projected rates?
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
Okay.
So for the operating reserve, everybody has some sort of target. Is yours 3 months of operating account?
Yes, it's 90 days.
90 days, okay. And then what is the capital reserve? How do you figure out what you want to have as a capital reserve?
We generally, we generally are kind of moving that based on the utility, but we're trying to get that to a point that allows us to have that amount of cash at the end of the year so we can position ourselves to initiate the designs and then carry out those cash-funded projects that following year. That really is what the cash that we're going to use to build those, like lift station improvements and what have you. It's a little different for landfill. Landfill will have a 180-day operating reserve based on what we feel that the risks are, and then a different operating reserve. But, the size of this utility, and that being about an $8 million gap, that's essentially what we're delivering each, in a typical year with cash.
Okay, and I guess I'll just, as a statement, say that I will be looking at these numbers and I won't be rubber stamping it, as I don't think anybody else will either. So that's all I got.
Thank you. Any other statements? Councilor Kiley.
Well, there's been a lot of question about populations. I mean, whether it's 5,000, I mean, it's 5,000 a day, and that's going to just continue to increase proportionally as well, too. You know, my concern is if we don't act now, if we wait even 2 years, the cost is just going to continue to escalate to do this. And our failure or inability to keep up with our need is going to have a much more drastic impact on this community than if we are proactive. And I think just what we did with some failing infrastructure back in 2010 and the amount of money that costs the community just to rectify something that probably should have been addressed long before that time, we would have avoided a lot of money expenditure on the city part, because anytime you're reacting, you're never able to do that as efficiently and as effectively as if you're proactive.
That's right.
And not to mention that the impact that it had on individuals and families. I wouldn't call this a dream plan. I would categorize this as a plan to just continue to meet our basic needs for the next 20 years. And then you're going to have to continue to plan for the next 20 years after that as well.
That's right.
I mean, this is a never-ending process. I mean, it's a responsibility of this city and this council to ensure that we can meet the needs of our community. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I do want to share that we did do a fact sheet for all the significant projects. You have them in front of you, and they're also near the door. They should really give you a good project overview and hopefully cover those key questions that your constituents would reach out to you on. Thank you again for having us.
Thank you. I like the simplicity of this. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. If there's no other questions for Director Cotter or his staff, we will move on to the next presentation. All right, the next item is public input. Councilor Janet Brecky.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I teach piano lessons on Monday nights, and I had a student I was not able to move, so I'm going to have to leave. Just wanted you to understand. I'm not leaving about wastewater. Okay. Right.
Thank you. Sounds good. And if you have feedback, Councilor Staley, on what Councilor Brecky is proposing, I would encourage you to send that to everyone. Thank you. And maybe, Councilor Brecky, if you want to just wait just a couple minutes so we can have your full attention while we clear the room. I'm shocked everyone doesn't want to stay. Just want to make sure we have your full attention on you. All right, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you, fellow council members, for allowing me the opportunity to present. I wanted to speak with you a little bit more about public input, an item that we have been working on, since I was elected. And I want you to know that this draft proposal is clearly a draft. My purpose here is to kind of inform you what I've been working on with the city attorney's office, and take any input or feedback that you can give me. And then also I have a couple of question marks I'd like to discuss with you, in addition to what's in writing, and get your feedback and thoughts on that as well. Basically, this proposal picks it up where we where it augments where we've been so far. As I look at it, I just want us to take a global look at this public input items. There are 4 types of public input that we've been working on. We started working on House Bill 1172, which was basically the state telling us that we needed to deal with how we were going to handle public input at informational meetings, special meetings, working sessions, so those informal meetings of the council. And our current procedure is that at those meetings, we allow public input at the end of the meetings for a 15-minute period, 5 minutes per person, and it has to be on matters that have been discussed in those meetings, so on the agenda items in those meetings. The second type of public input that we dealt with is the one at the beginning of our official business meetings, and in that public input, again, we currently allow 30 minutes total, 3 minutes per person, and no restriction on the content, basically an open mic, for people's opportunity to present to their council. And I'm proposing no change to that. This particular ordinance, I'm looking at dealing with, or discussing, having and discussing, and dealing with the issues we haven't really talked about. And that's number one, the public input on first readings, the public input on action items, and public input during quasi-judicial proceedings. As far as public input on first readings go, I'm proposing no change. I'm proposing leaving that at 3 minutes. And then I would make a distinction, as you look at my proposal, the reason I think it's appropriate to leave that at 3 minutes is because that's notice of a hearing. People are being granted a courtesy, to speak to, the content of an item, even though the only reason it's on the agenda is to just notice them that official hearing is forthcoming. So I think, it kind of mirrors that public input at the beginning of the meeting, and it's a good practice to have, 3 minutes there and then 3 minutes on that item. The thing that I am proposing to change is really in two places. I am proposing that we change the public input on what I call action items, and those are items that are scheduled for hearing or that we are taking final action or some action on at the meeting. And so the people there, either have an interest that they're, a personal interest or legal interest that they're there to talk about, or a right or privilege is being discussed. So those are the items that we're actually, conducting our business and making final decisions on. For that, I am suggesting 5 minutes. And the reason I'm suggesting 5 minutes for that is because we have, because it is an action item where we're discussing, again, rights and privileges, legal property rights, those kinds of things. I think that, 5 minutes is a legitimate suggestion. And the other thing is it does, I think it's kind of incongruent right now that we're allowing 5 minutes at the end of our informational meetings, our special meetings, and our working sessions. We allow 5 minutes, and they're, virtually those are not action items. We're not doing any action. It's a meeting like this one we just had, and we're going to let people talk to us for 5 minutes about that. It just seems only fair, or it would make it more consistent to, allow 5 minutes for when we're actually taking final action on something. So I think, again, it just seems incongruent to allow 5 minutes for one and not 5 minutes for something, to me, that's far more important than just allowing someone to comment, after an informal session. Because these are, at our actual official business meetings where we're doing the public's business, and so I think it's important to engage them. The other thing is that I learned in this process, as I was working with the city attorney's office, that the two things that we have to be cognizant of when we go into this, it's not so much whether it be 3 minutes or 5 minutes, which is what I was focusing on until I had them do the research. It's really more focusing on, what is, we don't want to get into a situation where we're actually managing the content of the speech. And if we're having a 3 minute, limit on the action items and we're constantly ignoring it or waiving it, then we can get into that dangerous area where we may be, giving unequal treatment to people. So the less that we have to waive it and we can just, stand by the time frame, I think the better that it is. And so that's another reason why I'm suggesting that we move that to 5 minutes. The other thing that I learned in the process from the city attorney's office was, and it comes up with my last item, the last proposal that I'm making is to deal with the quasi-judicial proceedings. When we're actually in, a quasi-judicial mode, you have to be careful about the kind of restrictions that you place on, and you don't really want to place just arbitrary, one-of-a-kind restrictions. And so what I provided in there, what I was trying to do there was to deal with the three areas of law. You've got your due process area, you've got your state law, which defines quasi-judicial, and then you've got your Robert's Rules of Order. And as I've watched our meetings play out, there's some confusion presently as to, who's on first, because we both have the discretion to, I guess, kind of set the parameters, in a quasi-judicial proceeding. So what I've attempted to do here is give the mayor, in concert with the city attorney's office, the discretion to determine, kind of on a case-by-case basis, how we're going to handle a quasi-judicial proceeding. Because again, what I learned from the city attorney's office it's really not about 5 minutes or 3 minutes, but it's about making sure that we provide a hearing in a manner that creates a meaningful opportunity to be heard. And that can be depending on the complexity of the case, depending on whether it's, it's a right or a legal right or a legal privilege. Any number of scenarios can actually be acceptable. So what I concluded was that what we needed to do is just put in, and the city attorney's office, suggested just put in the phrase due process. We'll follow due process. So if we follow due process in those proceedings, that should protect us and put them in a position to be able to defend us. So then I just wanted to then, again, come to a process that would be clear, so that we don't have confusion about what's going on when we're in that process. So that's when I put, okay, we're going to follow due process, and then we're going to, we're going to manage it flexibly, based on the situation, again, with the advice and consent of our legal counsel. And then we're going to follow the definition, the state law definition, because it defines when we're in quasi-judicial mode. There's a list of actions in SDCL 132-110 that kind of states what's quasi-judicial as opposed to what's not. And so we'll, again, with our city attorney's office, we will know when those actions are, require that procedure, and then follow their lead, subject to then Robert's rules of order, where as council members we also can decide how we want to handle the proceeding. So if we don't feel that it's being handled in a manner that is, creating an opportunity that's meaningful to be heard, we can say, hey, I make a motion and I want to have more time, or I want to, restrict, have less restrictions on the time limits, or waive the restrictions on the time limits. And so that exists already, but this provides an order for it. So we're going to have a procedure and, and be advised of it. And then if we want to make any motions, we'll make those motions. And then hopefully it will go forward a little more smoothly than it has been. So that's basically what I was attempting to try to do here. You will see in that quasi-judicial process, again, that there's an ability for the mayor to exercise discretion to adjust time restrictions or waive time restrictions completely, for a particular issue or process. And I think there's just a broad discretion, again, following the advice of the city attorney's office, to even, set time limits for, pros and cons for just, how much time you want to allow it. There's a lot of flexibility in how you would handle the situation based on the uniqueness of a given situation. The other, I guess, the final thing that I lost my train of thought there. So I'll just move on. Maybe it'll come to me. So that's what I was trying to accomplish in that, to provide that flexibility, again, with the council having its ability to be involved in that as well, and hopefully make that process go through a little more easily. And now I'd be glad to take some questions. I also have the city attorneys here that helped me. If you'd like to ask them questions, they are here to take questions as well. Oh, I did think of what it was. The other thing I wanted to mention is I talked to each of you, except I wasn't able to talk to Rick, but I talked to each of you about the directions I was going before I actually put this together. And the issue of the AV, the audio-visual equipment, came up again. And I was going to just put that back in because I thought, that there's certainly times when that serves a useful purpose, but then I learned from some of you about the difficulty that was associated with that, because we did have to regulate the content when we did that, and it had to go through several review processes because there was a danger of, terrible things being posted and then, put out to the public. And I was unaware of that, so I thank you for your feedback on that. I took that out of there, but it was still kind of in the back of my head that is an area where sometime we're going to want to see something, and we've completely taken that option away. So this is where I'm just asking for feedback from you. I'm wondering if in this area, again, in a quasi-judicial proceeding, now we're not in, just our regular action items, but in a quasi-judicial proceeding, again, where somebody's rights are being decided, if there's an audio-visual, that could be something that could be added there where I have the language that that the mayor has discretion to make adjustments to time, make adjustments to either waive, limit time restrictions or completely waive time restrictions. I could also put in there or allow use of AV equipment. And so just wanting your thoughts and feedback on that, whether that would be a good place, because I guess I can just imagine that there would be a time where, someone might have a video footage of something that we wanted to see. To my way of thinking, it would be less likely in that kind of setting to have some sort of random something show up. That's a hearing where people are there, their lawyers are there, the developers are there, they've got issues they're there for, and there just might be something that we'd want to see, and that would allow the mayor the flexibility to do that. So if anybody has any interest in dealing with that way, or if you can give me feedback on that, whether to add that or not, and anything else you're interested in, I'd be glad to discuss it.
Thank you for your presentation. Councilor Kiley.
Thank you. First of all, Councilor Brecky, thank you very much for the process in which you have employed to cover this information. And obviously for the time that you have put into it as well. Just for the point of clarification, I want to make sure that I understand your term of action items. You're referring to second readings and resolutions as action items where a final decision is being made?
Yes, and then there's kind of, sometimes they're legislative and sometimes they're policy and sometimes they're quasi-judicial, so there's differences in them, but when I'm referring to what that 5 minutes would apply to, it would be the ones that aren't quasi-judicial, but they're there for a final action.
Well, first of all, if there's something that we need to do to address the quasi-judicial or hearings that take place before this body, I have no problem in tweaking the language to make sure that we're in compliance with state law. And I know that we had a situation where Assistant City Attorney Danny Brown had already advised us that we should waive time restrictions. And so there again, I would have no problem tweaking that aspect of our current ordinance to be sure we are in compliance. And I will just say regarding the AV equipment, I would just point out too that individuals, it's far better if they don't wait until the first reading or the second reading to provide us with documents and information that they see as important or vital to our decisions, that they can certainly do that through phone calls or individual meetings or sending us the videos or the PowerPoint presentations beforehand, as we've received a lot of that regarding an item that is going to be before us here this evening. So I do appreciate your flexibility with that as well, with the AV equipment. Can you explain to me with managing content? I mean, because currently we have a limitation of 3 minutes, but the chair of the meeting, in these cases, the mayor, has that option of extending that. And if he doesn't, we have an option of requesting that extension. And if he doesn't, then we can require that go to a vote, so we can actually overturn the mayor. But if, let's say just for the sake of example here, we go from 3 minutes to 5 minutes on what you're referring to as action items. And so then we have some individuals that use only 1 minute or 2 minutes or 3, or some take 5. But others need then more time than 5, and they're granted an additional minute or 2. How is that any different from what we're currently doing right now with the 3 minutes and granting some additional time and not others because they didn't need it? How is that? How's that different? And tell me, how is that managing content? Because I do agree with you 100%. This body should not be managing content in any way, shape, or form. But can you tell me, how would that be any different? I'm going to start
an answer, and then I'm going to let the city attorney's office finish that, because they've given me a lot of information on that.
Okay.
But I think what I took from that was, yes, you can still use some flexibility to extend the time, but you probably want to get into doing that as little as possible, because the more you do it, the more there's a chance that, for example, you're going to let attorneys talk longer than someone that's kind of a rabble-rouser, and you set yourself up for some allegations that you're gaveling people down that you don't want to listen to, and you're letting others do it. So again, for me, the short answer is yes, you can do it, but if you put instead of putting a time limit that's too short and then waiving it all the time, put in one that's it's a good one that you're going to waive very rarely, and then again, be careful on how you do it and make sure that you don't do it in such a way that you're not letting minority voices be heard, or people who are not siding with your position be heard, or something like that. So that was part of why I in observing the meetings before I was elected, it seemed like very rarely was that 5-minute time limit an issue for those items where where the House was filled and people were talking. There was only a couple times that I observed that really required waiving. So that's why I kind of would recommend falling back to that again for those action items, and because, again, that is the date that's set for a hearing. It's not a notice. I mean, that's the date for a hearing, so that is the hearing date. That's the time when it's all supposed to come together and we're supposed to make our decision.
But don't we currently have that same option to extending that additional time with 3-minute policy? Don't we still have the same capability of ensuring that we do that as little as possible?
Yes, I think, but I again, just my observation was, and why I would like to go back, is you certainly do have at least 3 of us council members who would like to hear a little more information and not be so rigid on that 3 thing, but it seems like we're doing it quite a bit. Okay. Quite a bit. And the other thing, Rick, I'd like to get out of the position. I'm having people email me because now they're wanting me to make those motions to extend it, and I would like to, if we had it a little bit longer, I don't think it would happen as much. And then I don't want to be in that position either, where all of a sudden I'm the one, because I like to hear it, is constantly, causing this, this motioning to take place at the meeting. And again, when I looked back, to what was happening before, I just don't see myself being put in that position, but very rarely. And if it was, it would be the kind of situation where everybody would probably want it as well. So.
Thank you, Counselor.
Katie, can you come up and address that as well, or Stacy, whomever? I just would like to hear from you. Address Councilor Kiley's question, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Stacy Koister, City Attorney, Sioux Falls. So the question relates to the 3 and 5 minute, and I think the real answer there is it's a matter of frequency. You do have the same issue, the same dilemma, the same potential content aspect to it, whether you're at 3 or 5 or 2 or 10 minutes. And so you're sort of looking at a number and you're dealing with frequency. And so what I would point out from this, there are a couple points I'd like to make. One is we have been working on the language of this ordinance, but just to clarify, this is the same type of statutory review, ordinance review we would provide anybody. And the reason I point that out to you is because what you will not get from me, as long as I'm in this position or my office, is a political position on this. And the reason I say that is because I'm not here to advocate or to take a position on any lengths of time, right? And so in this case, 3 versus 5 versus 2 versus 10, that's what all of you get to decide, right? But if there's, in the event there's any time limit, and your point is well made, it becomes, okay, are we managing content? Because now you've got two areas of the law that you're touching on here. You've got the First Amendment, right, free expression to be heard, and you've got procedural due process. And so what is abhorrent to the law is content management. The minute limits we're talking about is procedural due process. So if you had hypothetically, you could look at a 15-second limit if you're having one that everybody would probably agree you're not getting anywhere there, right? But if you go to 2 minutes or 3 or 5, now you're into, when you're in that range, that's a decision all of you get to make. From our point of view, 3 and 5, that sort of decision As long as it falls within the bounds of the law, our interest being, advising the mayor, advising the council, we would want to avoid content management type stuff because that's where you run afoul of the law.
If I may, Madam Chair, what impact would it have on the process, the ability of the individual to contact us well before the meeting, not wait until the meeting itself, but to send us any amount of information that they desired?
Right. This is limited to the public meeting. There are a multitude of options for the public to contact all of you. Obviously, again, now we're in procedural due process. That's how we're managing this particular meeting.
Okay, thank you.
So would you, if I can just add a question since it relates to that, would you suggest then not extending it past the 5 minutes? Because essentially then you're not managing. So say it changes to 5 minutes and say, do not extend it. It's 5 minutes. When you see the red button, too bad. Would you suggest it being that? Because essentially then you're not waiving any right. You're not picking winners and losers. You're not having that potential happen. Regardless of frequency, we've just made it 0 if we don't extend it.
And that's a great question, and you're in sort of the same analysis when it comes to the 3 and 5 minutes as to whether I'm advising the mayor how to handle it as the presiding officer, which is the language in the ordinance, or if it goes to a vote for all of you. I would advise all of you equally not to manage that content. And so, yes, I mean that's
essentially we could remove that line that says that it lets it, I mean, we could just make it more strict and say, if it is 5 minutes, then it's 5 minutes, nothing more than 5 minutes, because then we're not walking down that slippery slope of allowing some to do it and some not to do it. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just hypothetically speaking when you said the variance of it may or may not, that be, essentially we remove it by saying no one is allowed to make it go any further. I'm not saying I suggest it. I'm
understood.
Bringing it for a point of topic. Okay, Councilor Neitzer.
Well,
go ahead.
May I respond to that
Sure.
one? That's the balancing of risk, and the safe harbor is exactly that. No additional comment whatsoever because you're not even subject to an allegation of managing content. The instant you go past that, and you've got a timer, if you're theoretically a second different between the parties, one can allege that they've been aggrieved. So right. And that's where you almost fall into the 3 and 5 minute analysis. This also cracks the door to a quasi-judicial discussion, which of course the ordinance is different in that respect as to that piece. So,
Councilor Neitzer.
Thank you. There's a lot of good stuff here. Speaking of quasi-judicial, and I think this may be changed in the last hearing, and I don't think I was there for it, but the thing that's always, that if you haven't looked at it already, that might be worthwhile looking at is what's always bugged me or bothered me as far as due process are the matter of disclosures. So like in the past, what we would do is we would get public input on or we'd have people come up and talk about the item, it's some quasi-judicial whatever. And then they sit down. Public input is now closed. Now we go down the line and we make disclosures. I went out and I saw the site. I saw whatever, blah, blah, blah. I might have just said something now, and somebody over there is just itching that wants to rebut something that I saw, but they didn't know it until public input was closed. It seems to me that could be a serious due process issue. So the order of operations, I would think, and maybe we've already rectified that. I don't remember in the last hearing, that maybe that needs to be looked at, that we need to make disclosures before public input or something. So, because as of right now, at least in the past, nobody could, what if I say something and it's just flat out wrong, or I say I go and saw something I went on site and I saw this, and,
Right, and when you talk about due process, and of course anybody who's been a lawyer and litigated in court, what you want is a neutral fact finder, right? And so the purpose of the disclosures is, I have this additional information because, judges aren't supposed to do that either, right? They go out and investigate. They're supposed to weigh the evidence that's presented to them. Now, the reality, to my knowledge, is that right now there's no ordinance on exactly that quasi-judicial procedure, which necessitated Assistant City Attorney Danny Brown, prior to that quasi-judicial hearing, and it is a hearing, to provide that list, and that's fine, and that worked in that context. But as we sit here, this ordinance now it does touch on and provide really some guidance as to the quasi-judicial function, which basically is in accordance with due process. It doesn't address the 3 and 5 minute piece. It's saying, you know, consistent with due process, which of course can be, you know, if you read the research and case law on it, sometimes due process can be a couple minutes, sometimes it can take a couple hours. I mean, when you practice in court, you have some hearings that are lengthy and take, you know, but the piece you're talking about, right, is one where they don't want the judge, the quasi-judge, for lack of a better term, to come in with preconceived notions, and that's the duty to disclose. So.
Okay.
Does that address your?
Yeah, I think so. Just something to look at to make sure that we're doing it in the right order so that everybody's covered, because somebody may appeal one of our decisions someday and put it to the test. I will say, and this is as much for Councilor Brecky as you, I do like that there's been a little bit of moving around so that basically it looks like everything for public input on agenda items is in one paragraph or one subsection, and then everything for general is in another, because before it was kind of mishmashed, and I think that it, just a plain reading of it for if somebody's coming into it, it was kind of confusing, I think. So that, I like that subtle little moving around, I guess.
Could you step up to the microphone, please? Thank you.
I would just say thank you. That was by design, because I think it was one of those things, because you work a little on it here, you work a little on it here, and all of a sudden it gets kind of discombobulated. And so one of the things I was trying to correct when I went in was to just kind of clean up the order of things so that it read better.
It does flow better, and one of the issues has always been that they talk, there's public input portion and public input, which I think is kind of terrible, because it's so confusing, you know, because when I say public input, are we talking about public input during an agenda item? I almost wish it was like general public comment was what we called the beginning thing, and then public input was what we called agenda items, to create because there's always that, what public input are you talking about? So
We settled on the phrase for that one, you know, public input at the start of the meeting. It's a long phrase, but that's what we settled on for that.
And I do see that
Tried to
public
use
input
it
portion.
consistently throughout.
Yep, and that does look like that's improved. As far as the AV equipment, I will say I never really had a big issue with that. So if there was some mechanism, I wouldn't fall on my sword about that one. And then, so just to be clear, as far as waivers go, so for the 3 and the 5, the way it's written now and with other code, is it still the case where the council could? I mean, could waivers happen for the 3 and the 5 minutes as this draft is written?
Yes. I will say my opinion, but I think pursuant to Robert's Rules of Order, again, that would still allow that. But I was trying to put this in such a way that it would be done rarely, you know, is what.
Sure.
But I believe that would still be possible. And however, I would say that Katie would advise me that, you know, again, if you're going to have restrictions, you should stick with your restrictions. Pretty much.
Yeah.
Is that a fair statement?
Because
it's when you get too discretionary with your restrictions that you get into that discretion-based potential argument.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you do see cases in other jurisdictions where the weekly rabble-rouser comes up and, you know, they sit them down immediately, and then somebody else can go on for 10 minutes. And so obviously one could argue it's content. We don't like what this person says every week, therefore we don't grant him any discretion, but we do to this person. So you can make that inference, even if you didn't say out loud, I'm telling you to sit down because I don't like it. It's readily apparent what you might be doing. So, okay, so.
I think if I could just add to that, because I think that really is bingo, because it's not, I mean, we're not going to actually, you know, corruptly regulate content. It's kind of accidentally how you can trip into it. And I think you described the perfect example of how that could be done, you know, after just years of hearing someone and then you cut them off too short or whatever you do, treat them differently. But there's other subtle ways, too, that it happens without you even thinking that you're doing anything wrong.
Yeah, so the intent of the 5 is so that there's just less opportunity for people to feel that they were cut off, and then us making constant waivers is what you're going for.
Do it less. You would do it quite a bit less, I think, again, based on my observations of how it was working before.
And then finally, the quasi-judicial, so what would be the quote-unquote normal time limit, if any, for a quasi-judicial item?
Well, what I was given to understand, and again, this is, I'll say my piece and then let the attorneys speak, is that you really need to just let that concept kind of go, because what you need to focus on more is what is the kind of issue that's before you? Is it a complicated issue? Is it, and then tailor your hearing so that people have a reasonable opportunity to be heard, or what was the phrase I used, that is handled in a manner that they feel like their public input is heard.
Okay.
And so there can be time restrictions, or it could be a few minutes, it could be 2 hours, just depending on the nature of it.
Well, and this is maybe for the attorney in the last question. So let me give an example. Let's say we're doing some sort of video lottery quasi-judicial item to approve a license, right? And we have some testimony, and it's really quote unquote on point. And again, the judging content. Somebody comes up and they go on a monologue, and they're at minute 13, ranting and raving maybe about how they don't like video lottery, for example, and that South Dakota shouldn't have it. It's a tax on the poor, and all, all of these things that doesn't have anything to do with the particular item. Is there, what's the discretion for a chair at what point to say, okay, that's plenty, we're at minute 13, or does it just go on and on?
Well, a couple things there. One is that due process, like right now, the statute says 3 minutes basically across the board. That doesn't mean due process doesn't exist, right? I mean, at 3 minutes, due process could be more or less than that. When you get into that, there are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, meaning redundancy or cumulative information. That's, again, in a quasi-judicial hearing, like a judicial hearing, sometimes you need lengthy testimony, sometimes you don't, and it's sort of, if you have hearings where you've got 30 people coming up and saying the same thing, and you've got one person, opposing that, somebody coming in and having 30 redundant, types of testimony, there are ways to limit that, and that due process allows you to do that. So to go on, anybody who's ranting or who's just repeating the same thing over and over, that's part of the restriction. Arguably, not having a time restriction gives you some more flexibility with that, because you're not playing referee right off the bat, or somebody's getting cut off, because there are certain elements of how do you prepare for a hearing where there is a time restriction. So again, I'm not advocating for either one, because due process exists regardless. It's the form and function of your quasi-judicial hearing, how you want that, and you all voted previously saying we wanted it this way. This is an ordinance to change that. This distinguishes, whereas before it didn't really distinguish, it was across the board. So if the concern is, and I'm not saying this is your concern, but if there's concern that, well, we're going to have to sit through a 5-hour quasi-judicial hearing, theoretically that could have been the concern with a 3-minute response if due process demanded it. You can't deny due process. And so whether you make that change is basically how you're conducting that hearing, what sort of baseline you're starting from, and what do you want it to look like. And that's why I would emphasize within the law, everything that's being discussed here is legal. It's for you to decide what right looks like. And it's not abhorrent to me as a city attorney if you would say, well, due process controls, because due process controls anyway. Again, it's just how you manage it.
So I'll close by saying I'll sit through a 5-hour due process hearing if necessary. That's fine. But it would be, you think it'd be defensible on the grounds if somebody is, let's say, going on as far as maybe relevance or duplication to say, we've heard what you had to say, but we're at minute 13, and this is a general statement about your displeasure maybe with the state law, but it has nothing to do with this particular item, or we've heard the same thing 22 times, and that you could defend that is what you're saying.
I think
a chair telling him that's...
Well, I think that's why I'm sitting right there, and that concern applies again to the mayor and the council. And so at some point you can say, yes, in my opinion, right, it's a game time decision, but in my opinion, we're now in the redundant stage of this, and we need to move on, and you're entitled to cut someone off.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilor Selberg.
Thank you. Councilor Brecky, I think you've done a nice job kind of putting this together. I appreciate the fact that you reached out and kind of asked for input and let us know what you were up to and kind of got some feedback with it. certainly makes sense for the most part. I mean, basically in simple terms, you're tweaking some language so we're in compliance with state law, and other than that, the only thing you're changing is 5 minutes for final actions, right?
Right.
Missing anything else?
Nope.
Okay.
That's,
So,
yeah, kind of as I worked through the process, that's all that I think, I don't know, that increases my comfort level a lot, but I guess, yeah, that's all I'm doing.
pretty much, okay. Well, no, I appreciate you reaching out, and I know you've been working on it for a while, so appreciate your diligence in bringing this to us today. Thank you.
I would just ask, again, is there anything more that I should be addressing? Is there, is there anything more I should be addressing? And I would like a little more feedback on the AV thing. Should I put that in there? Just afterwards, you guys can, continue the dialogue, I guess is what I'm saying. If there's something I missed or something that, is really causing some ire, I'd like to know.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, then I'll take my turn, I guess, since I have to go last. So my question I would have is, are you intending to change the informational meeting or the committee meeting to essentially match the 3 minutes of non-action items? Is that something that would be in, because right now, I mean, we're not consistent. For an informational meeting, it's a minimum of 15 minutes if there's people here to speak, and you get 5 minutes to speak, versus what we're doing at the, essentially what we're doing for your proposal would be 3 minutes on non-action items. And really, all of the committee meetings and informational meetings are non-action items. We can't vote in these meetings. We may say, keep working on it, move it along, whatever, give some sort of guidance, say what we like or don't like. But I'm curious if that would be in some sort of proposal, just so it's streamlined, so it's not 5 minutes here, 3 minutes here. Where are we with that, if that would be something that you'd be willing to change as well?
Well, that was one of the issues that, I was trying to address, was that it was kind of weird. And again, it's because it kind of happened, it kind of happened consecutively instead of holistically when we did it. So we did that first, so then, and then, the first reads the first reading 3 minute kind of came around later. I could go either way with that if there's an interest, but I do think, but I didn't like the idea that you could talk to us for 5 minutes about virtually nothing and something really important. You could only have 3. Right. That's more what I dove into. But I would be open to, switching it the other way and say, okay, making a clean distinction between action and non-action items, informational kinds of things.
Yeah, for consistency. I just wasn't sure if that was ever discussed. I'll say for the AV stuff, for me personally, I feel like we have so many other options of getting the information in advance outside of the information gathering time. Also, we have the option that people can make a copy. We can follow along on our email. We can follow along with a paper copy. I know that's been done as well. We did allow for the photos and having that in there. And so for the amount of time that it has taken in some of the other areas to really go through to make sure that due diligence is done for that. I think that that's something that I wouldn't prefer putting back in. For me personally, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else. That's just me personally, since you asked. The other thing,
you prefer
to not add it back in.
Okay, yeah.
To leave it as it's written right now, because we have options. And now, if we had no option at all, then it might be a little bit different. But just for the simple fact that it can be sent, and I'm
let me clarify, Christine, because here's what my concern is. Again, now that we're using the term action items, I agree based on what you told me. I thought, geez, I don't want them to have to go through this again for the public input at the start of the meetings. And even for action items, I can't visualize a lot of things that we would need that for. All I'm talking about is kind of adding it to the quasi-judicial thing, because in that one, again, we shouldn't be getting too much outside information. I'm going to use an example, the issue that's before us tonight. We've all heard about the video with the water flow, which ended up being a very important piece of that issue. And, again, they've been working on it. And some of us have seen it and will be disclosing it. And, that's the kind of thing that perhaps all of us should have, that someone should be allowed to play at the hearing and see. And the mayor, where I would put it is so that that discretion could be exercised to allow it in those proceedings. So it
For
would be
only the quasi-judicial?
only quasi-judicial, so it'd be very limited. And again, I was talking hypothetically today with TJ actually about it, and by the way, I have run this by the mayor's office as well. And, you know, he said, they're just saying it's at your guys' will, you know, what, they don't want, you know, want to get involved. They say, this is your opportunity. They don't have a problem with it as best as I can tell. But anyway, you know, in that scenario, I could just imagine in quasi-judicial proceedings, some of us will see something that all of us should see. And, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and especially like in that drainage issue, that was, you know, something we probably all needed to see, and we were going to want to see it. And so how could there be a vehicle for that to be allowed? So this would, what I would suggest putting in is right after the word, with due process, including the adjustment or waiver of restrictions, comma, or use of AV equipment. In other words, then the mayor could allow AV equipment to be used in a quasi-judicial proceeding. And again, when I was talking with TJ about it, we couldn't come up with a situation where we'd get hit with something, you know, totally kind of out there, because we would require them to go through the screening process. But again, this would be something they would be preparing for a hearing, and, you know, presumably they'd have it, and, you know, we'd know about it in advance, where we require that we would know about it in advance.
But
and that's going to be
in the example tonight, though, that's not a quasi-judicial item. Showing that video wouldn't even be in the quasi-judicial, I don't believe. Is it? That one is too, then?
It's a rezoning.
It's a rezoning one, okay, sorry. So I want to be careful that we look at that, you know, and making sure that we, you know, give the rights. There's a difference in information gathering of us being the representatives and going out and doing our homework and diving in and doing site visits if we need to, taking phone calls, returning emails, all of that I think is important. The only other little suggestion I would give too is making sure that we make it very, very clear of final action item. I don't know that that's defined in state law, and so I'd want to be very careful that we might need to just spell out what those 1, 2, 3 items are for the final action, whether it says second reading, resolution, or whatever those final action items are, just so it doesn't come, well, I thought this was final action. No, this, I mean, just to make it very, very clear for that. That would be my feedback for that one too, just ensuring that that definition is well defined. And making it as clean as possible. So any other comments, questions?
Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
Just for a point of clarification on something that you had stated when we were talking about informational 5-minute maximum per individual, and you said 15 minutes minimum. Did you mean 15 minutes maximum?
Maximum, I'm sorry, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes, please clarify that. Go ahead, Councilor Neitzer.
I think you really did make a good point about the quasi-judicial item. I think that's something everybody should rethink a little bit when it comes to the AV, because really they shouldn't be showing me a video prior to the hearing. That's not what should be happening. It should all be happening here.
Right.
So given that, if it was restricted just to that, I think that's something to seriously consider, whether AV should be opened up, because then we run into disclosures. We don't want them to be having to send things to us in advance. In fact, that's not what we should be doing.
And knowing who got it, who didn't, who saw it, who didn't. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that we probably need a little a refresher course on quasi-judicial as well to ensure that we're all making the proper disclosures going forward too, so we don't get ourselves in that kind of prickly pear in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I will take a look at both of those. I think that's very helpful, Christine, about exactly, because that was just my term to try to talk to you about it, but I'll get some help with the attorney's office to pin that down better.
Yep. And we'll continue the conversation. Thank you for bringing that forward. We will turn it over to public input. Is there any public comment at this time? You still get 5 minutes, Scott, for now.
Oh, I'll fight that. Scott Harris from Sioux Falls. The funny part about this is actually in reality on a second reading, there shouldn't be any time limit for people to come up here if they're fighting for something for their neighborhood or whatever, as long as they're not being redundant or saying the same thing somebody else said. They should be able to make their case. And then secondly, the AV equipment should be able to be used simply because we paid for it. You guys didn't pay for it, we paid for it. It's our equipment, really. It's not, the staff gets to come up here and use it all they want, but we've actually paid for it. It's our equipment, and if we want to make a PowerPoint presentation, we should be able to do that. The one thing I have to remind counselors all the time is, and city staff, is that if you go to the charter, there's no place in the charter that puts a time limit on the meetings. And when we start talking about time limits and testimony, what we're really essentially saying is, well, our meetings are getting too long. According to what? According to what? According to the charter, there is no time limits on the meeting. If the chair decides, you know what, we're here at 1 o'clock in the morning, and this is getting long, he or she can recess that meeting and move it on. There is no time limits on the meeting. Number two, you all chose to run for this office. You knew that you'd have to go to meetings. You get paid to be here. City staff gets paid to be here. Once again, no time limits on the things. Nobody's being taken advantage of. They're all getting paid to be here. No time limits on the meetings. I think we need to open this up more, public input. We need more public input. We need more time to talk. In the past administration, we had 8 years of closed door. And many of you ran on opening this up more. The mayor ran on it, many councilors ran on it, and I'm waiting to see it. We need to open the gates, man. We need to see our government. We don't need to be spending, the Public Assurance Alliance doesn't need to be spending $100,000 defending a secret settlement that was a lie. I'm sorry, that we need to open up our government. And having this discussion about 3 minutes or 5 minutes, you know how I feel about it. If it's an action item, they should be able to speak as long as they need to make their case. I think Stacy Koistra made the point best. Is it really a discussion about 3 minutes or 5 minutes? No, it's not. It's a discussion about what is fair. And what is fair is there's no time limits on the meetings. So that means if someone needs to make a case about something that's important to them, they should have the time to do so. And on top of that, there was the comment that said, one of you commented that, well, they can contact us ahead of time. I find that laughable in itself. My experience of following city government for 12 years is that some of you are very good at getting back to the constituents. Some of you are so-so, and some of you do not respond to constituents whatsoever. I know. So this whole saying that, they have an opportunity to contact us, sure, they can contact you all they want, but some of you just don't get back to us if you're not interested in what we have to say. And, on top of that, Pat distracted me here. It really needs to be said in public. There's certain things that need to be said at this podium. In an email or a phone call between a constituent and one of you counselors, sometimes those things need to be said up here and on the public record. So this argument, back and forth. But I wanted to comment quick since I have a minute on, this discussion about raising fees to pay for the water plant. I find it really funny that we've given away tens of millions of dollars to Foundation Park so they can hire a bunch of warehouse workers when we were promised all kinds of things, tens of millions of dollars in infrastructure, and they've not given us anything for it. And then we've also turned around and given out in the financial report today millions and millions of 20-year TIFs. And this time we're taking $260 million in water and schools and jails. It's time for everybody in this community to pay their fair share of taxes. And enough with the TIFs and enough with the handouts out at Foundation Park for a bunch of pallet humper jobs. I'm sorry, that really makes me angry that we put out that much money of my money and got those kind of jobs in return.
Thank you, Scott. Anybody else? And just to be clear for the record, the rezone tonight is not quasi-judicial. So the item that we were talking about, I know I was a little back and forth, but the rezone is not a quasi-judicial when we were talking about showing that water. So I just want to make sure I stated it so it wasn't incorrect again. All right, seeing we are done, we will be back at 7 o'clock. Thank you, and we'll have our informational next week on the 23rd.